On the night of August 31st, 1939, a transmission went out from a radio station near the German-Polish border. By the next morning, Hitler stood before the Reichstag, citing Polish aggression, and German tanks were crossing into Poland. By September 3rd, amateur radio licenses had been revoked in both Germany and Britain, and transmitting equipment was being confiscated from thousands of operators. In less than a week, the shortwave bands that had connected a civilian radio community across national borders went silent. The German shutdown came first, on the same morning as the invasion, and the speed of it tells you how long the groundwork had been building. The DASD, Germany's National Amateur Radio Organization, had been brought under Nazi Party and military oversight during the 1930s. Licensed German operators were not running independent stations the way their British or American counterparts were. By the summer of 1939, amateur radio in Germany was already a supervised, state-directed activity, and the administrative machinery for a total shutdown was already in place. All that was missing was a reason to use it. That reason arrived on the evening of August 31st, and it came through a radio transmitter. A small team of SS operatives disguised as Polish insurgents forced their way into a radio station at Gleiwitz, a city right on the German-Polish border, known today as Gleiwitz, Poland. A Polish-speaking member of the team grabbed the microphone, read a brief hostile announcement in Polish on the station's frequency, and the group withdrew within minutes. To make the story hold, they left behind a body. A local German farmer who had been drugged, dressed in a Polish military uniform, and left at the scene as fabricated physical evidence of a Polish attack. That staged broadcast at Gleiwitz was one element of a broader campaign that had been running all week. German intelligence and the SS had organized a coordinated series of staged provocations along the entire German-Polish frontier under the code name Operation Himmler. Multiple incidents were manufactured to look like unprovoked Polish aggression, and the Gleiwitz broadcast was part of that campaign, all of it designed to hand Hitler the pretext he needed. He put that pretext to use the very next morning. On September 1st, 1939, Hitler addressed the Reichstag live on German radio, cited the alleged Polish attacks without naming Gleiwitz specifically, and announced that Germany was now returning fire. His speech went out on shortwave and was picked up by receivers far beyond Europe. CBS and NBC relayed the address internationally with live English translation. Any amateur operator or shortwave listener tuned to the right frequency that morning heard a head of state declaring war in real time, carried across the Atlantic on the same radio spectrum that connected the amateur community. What those listeners did not know yet was that the speech marked the beginning of the end for civilian access to those frequencies across most of Europe. On that same day, the Reichspost Direction, the German postal authority responsible for radio licensing, revoked every amateur radio license in the country. Out of the entire national amateur community, only a handful of stations, reported as roughly 3, were authorized to keep operating, and only under direct government supervision. A small, controlled remnant continued throughout the war under military oversight, but for the ordinary German ham, the morning of the invasion was the last time they keyed a transmitter for years. The silence from the German bands was noticed almost immediately by operators in neighboring countries, and within days it spread. When Britain officially entered the war on September 3, 1939, the British government revoked all amateur transmitting licenses across the country. Transmitting equipment was impounded, and in many cases, receiving equipment was confiscated as well. Roughly 2,000 licensed British amateurs lost access to their stations in a matter of days. One personal account, preserved in a radio club archive in Leicester, captures what that transition felt like. An operator identified by his old call sign, G2CFC, sat at his receiver on September 3, 1939, listening to Neville Chamberlain's broadcast from London declaring war on Germany. He knew, as every licensed ham in Britain knew, exactly what that declaration meant for his station and his equipment. The shutdown itself is well documented in amateur radio history. What almost nobody outside the intelligence community knew at the time was what came next. Within weeks, MI5 established the Radio Security Service, and through the Radio Society of Great Britain, military intelligence quietly began recruiting the same amateur operators whose equipment it had just confiscated. The work was classified, the pay was nothing, and the task was specific. Use the Morse code skills these operators had spent years developing to monitor shortwave frequencies for clandestine enemy transmissions that the military didn't have the manpower to cover on its own. These recruits were designated voluntary interceptors, and within roughly 3 months, about 50 were active, scanning the bands from their homes using whatever receiving equipment they had retained or were now issued. Over the course of the war, the network grew to well over 1,000 civilian listeners, forming one of the largest unpaid intelligence operations in British wartime history. The same government that had confiscated their transmitters turned around and gave them a classified listening assignment, because the skills that earned them their licenses were exactly what the intelligence services needed most. British hams at least survived the war and eventually returned to the air. In Poland, the cost of the invasion reached further. The best documented individual case carries a weight that extends well beyond amateur radio. Father Maximilian Kolbe was a Polish Franciscan friar who held a licensed amateur station, SP3RN, at his monastery in Niepokalanów. He had established the station in 1938, calling it Radio Niepokalanów, just 1 year before the German invasion arrived. Kolbe was arrested on September 19, 1939, less than 3 weeks after the invasion began. He was held for several months before being released on December 8, 1939. His radio station was shut down under the occupation and never went back on the air. Some amateur radio sources have claimed Kolbe's arrest was specifically motivated by German suspicion that his radio work was espionage. But the more detailed biographical and religious history sources point to a broader pattern. His monastery at Niepokalanów had been sheltering refugees, including Jewish families, and it had been publishing anti-Nazi material. His second and final arrest, in February 1941, came after he refused to sign a German ethnic registration document. Kolbe was sent to Auschwitz concentration camp, where on August 14, 1941, he volunteered to take the place of a fellow prisoner who had been selected for execution by starvation. He was killed by lethal injection in the starvation bunker of Block 11, after 2 weeks without food. In 1982, the Catholic Church canonized him as a martyr and a saint. His amateur call sign, SP3RN, was never heard on the bands again. On the other side of the Atlantic, American ham operators experienced those same years from behind their receivers, not as participants in the shutdown, but as listeners. U.S. amateur bands stayed open through all of 1939, all of 1940, and most of 1941 without any disruption. The first wartime restriction from the FCC didn't arrive until 1940, and it only limited certain foreign amateur communications, leaving domestic operating fully intact. American hams and the broader shortwave listening public spent those years tuning in to European war coverage as free civilian listeners, hearing the same broadcasts and the same growing silences that their counterparts across the Atlantic were now barred from monitoring. It wasn't until the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, more than 2 years after the invasion of Poland, that U.S. amateur radio was fully suspended. That suspension led to the War Emergency Radio Service in 1942 and, after the war, the modern RACES system. On the night the invasion started, a ham operator sitting at a shortwave receiver heard a fabricated broadcast, then a real declaration of war, and then, one by one, the signals from across Europe going dark. In Germany, the shutdown took a single day. In Britain, it took a few days, but it gave rise to one of the war's most effective civilian intelligence networks. In Poland, it cost a Franciscan priest his station and eventually his life. And in the United States, operators sat at their receivers and listened to all of it for 2 more years, until Pearl Harbor finally pulled them off the air too.